Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. People have been asking for a military analysis of 300, Rise of an Empire, and I have decided now is a good time to make this video. Before we jump in, I need to make some disclaimers. First, I'm not going to be talking about the actual historical battles, which this film depicts in a fictional manner. I am familiar with a couple of the battles in this film. However, I am not making a comparison. I am instead looking at the tactics and strategies in the film and seeing if they make any sense. Second, I am going to use a number of comical names for the principal characters in this film, but I bear no animosity towards the actors and actresses or the filmmakers. All of the names are made in humour. Third, I am not going to be discussing the individual heroics or incredible feats performed by the principal characters in this film, because it is part of generic convention that heroes and villains are capable of great actions, which lesser mortal men would be unable to perform. Fourth, as in 300, no one is dressed sensibly for warfare. Except for these guys, I think. I have already discussed why this attire, or lack thereof, isn't sensible in my military analysis of 300, so I won't talk about that here. Alright, let's go. The first battle in the film is an ahistorical depiction of the Battle of Marathon. There are a number of things which make a lot of tactical and strategic sense in the beginning battle. Due to the narration of King This Is Sparta's Wife, and the actual film, we are told the Athenians, led by arch-moron Themistocles, attacked the Persians as they were landing at Marathon after a month at sea.
He makes landfall at the field of Marathon with an invading force which outnumbers the Greek defenders 3-1. And so at dawn, the hopeless Athenians do the unthinkable. They attack. They attack the weary Persians as they disembark their ships on shaky legs after a month at sea. They attack before they can establish their war camp and supply their soldiers. And who is the architect of this mad strategy?
In this scene, we can see the Persians haven't finished unloading their ships, and not all the men have disembarked from the ships either, so the Athenians chose to attack them at a great time. For some reason, This Is Sparta's Wife says that this was a mad strategy, but it would have been far madder to wait for the Persians to finish unloading and finish arranging themselves for battle. However, the Athenians don't exactly execute their strategy very well. They charge down the hill towards the Persians to take advantage of their ill-prepared state, but the Greeks don't make use of their primary advantage. Question: why is it best to attack a foe who has not arranged his forces for battle? Answer: because men who are not arranged for battle will find it harder to fight as a team. And if your soldiers are arranged for battle, they will be able to outfight your enemy with relative ease. Note that this advantage is contingent on your own men being properly arranged and fighting as a team. But the Athenians, like the Spartans in 300, don't fight as a team. They don't form a shield wall, a phalanx, or anything of the sort. They charge down the hill and fight as individuals, not as a team or a group of teams. So arch-moron Themistocles and his men threw away their main advantage against the Persians. If they had fought as a grand single unit, they would have slaughtered the Persians with greater ease. Regardless, the Athenians successfully contest the landing and cause the Persians to retreat. Arch-moron kills King Darius with an arrow, and this is an important plot point in the film. Now let us skip forward 10 years. Xerxes is now king of Persia and has been preparing the Persian Empire to conquer Greece and finish what his father started. The Greeks quickly figure out what the Persians are planning and seem to know where their forces will move as well. Arch-moron Themistocles explains that the Persian forces are going to enter Greece via Thermopylae. However, the Persians also have a massive fleet, so although they want to march through the Hot Gates, they also have the ability to bypass Thermopylae and land other forces on the coasts of Greece. Therefore, a plan is agreed where Spartans and men from several other Greek city-states will defend the Hot Gates, while the Greek allied fleet led by Themistocles will defend the Straits of Artemisium so the Persian navy cannot bypass Thermopylae. This strategy is well formed, but there are some problems, the main one being the small force defending the Hot Gates, but that we needn't discuss, as the film doesn't concern itself with Thermopylae too much. What concerns this analysis is Archon Themistocles' forces. Themistocles commands a combined force of 50 triremes. Just 50. Meanwhile, the Persian fleet is reported to number in the thousands. You cannot do a lot with a fleet of 50 when your enemy's ships number more than 1,000, and all of Themistocles' commanders wisely recognize this. One of them reports to Themistocles that a small advance force of Persian ships have taken refuge from a storm across the strait. Another commander explains the reason why it would be a good idea to attack this smaller fleet.
The gods have given us an opportunity to wound the Persians and strengthen Greek morale.
But arch-moron Themistocles says,
A tempting distraction, but we'll stick to the battle plan. Today at sundown we will sail out to meet the main Persian fleet. We will attack them in the open water with no shore to narrow the battle.
His commanders point out that
to attack a force of over 1,000 ships with our meager force is suicide.
And arch-moron Themistocles agrees with them.
Such is my plan.
Now, I shouldn't have to point out why going into an open sea battle against a navy, which is more than 10 times bigger than yours, is a terrible strategic decision. But I want to provide another reason why arch-moron Themistocles should have agreed to an attack on the small advance force. One word: capture. In naval warfare during the ancient eras, it was often the case that ships and galleys were captured rather than sunk. Before the advent of cannons and gunpowder, it was much more difficult to sink ships, even though rams did exist. So often battles were decided by boarding. The Romans, in their wars with Carthage, took control of the sea, not by sinking the Carthaginian ships, but by boarding them. And in the first part of the actual historical battle of Artemisium, the Greeks managed to capture 30 ships from the Persians. Considering that the Allied fleet only has 50 ships, it would make a lot of sense to attempt to acquire more ships. Since there is a smaller Persian fleet hiding in a cove somewhere nearby, it would make sense for the Greeks to attempt to capture some of these ships for their own fleet, assuming of course that the Greeks have the men to man them. But apparently arch-moron just likes suicidal plans. So the first naval engagement begins. Now something completely ridiculous and foolish about this is both commanders have set sail during a light storm. Thunder and lightning are heard in the background, and the clouds are both dark and many. While the sea isn't that rough, it is not calm, and with the clouds, lightning and thunder being what they are, the weather could turn at any moment. No naval commander worth his salt would order his fleet into battle during a potential storm unless he had no choice. Fighting at sea during a storm is difficult and dangerous, and if you can wait, you should wait. And Crazy Lady, aka Artemisia, certainly could have waited if she wanted. I don't know why arch-moron is going out to battle, because it would make more sense for him to look at the weather and say, this storm is bound to get worse. Let's wait and see if it will destroy the enemy fleet. At any rate, it makes less sense for him to go out to sea than it does for Crazy Lady, because his fleet consists of triremes. Crazy Lady's fleet consists of... I'm not even sure what these are. They look like massive galleys clad with iron in some places, most notably at the front. In any case, Artemisia's ships look like they can take the weather as it is. Looking at the Allied fleet, I am far from convinced these little galleys would be able to survive or operate in this weather. It should be noted that war galleys weren't actually designed to fight in bad weather, and it was common to take the galleys ashore during bad weather to protect them from the elements. Anyway, a battle happens in spite of the weather. The advance force of the Persian fleet just decides to charge, but the Greek fleet adopts this formation. It looks strange, but this formation, which consists of two circles, is actually based on a real formation which was adopted by navies at the time to avoid being outflanked and to break apart upon a signal to pick off enemy ships. The main difference between this version in the film and the historical formation is the film formation involves the ships presenting their broadsides to the enemy, rather than their bows, which is silly because the reason this formation existed was to avoid being outflanked, and then to break apart during battle to try and outmaneuver enemy ships. By adopting this silly version of the formation, the oarsmen must expend extra energy to turn the ships around, so they can actually strike the incoming ships with their rams. And this is something which is easy to forget, but oarsmen only have a limited pool of energy. They will get tired of rowing eventually, so it is best to adopt strategies and tactics which use energy expediently. The Greek galleys do turn around so they can move through the Persian line. They are given the signal to do so via a flag, which is a nice touch, as filmmakers sometimes forget to depict any signalling devices in battle scenes. As for the battle itself, there isn't too much to criticise. The Persian warships are plated with metal at the bow and the stern, so the Greeks rammed the ships in the middle. Because the Persian ships are very large and bulky, the Greek galleys quickly outmaneuver them and hit their broadsides. Now we see a few shots where two Greek galleys ram into a Persian warship on either side, but this actually isn't necessary. One successful ram would be more than enough to cause a ship like this to sink, because A hole in a ship is a hole and will let water in, and B, because these ships are plated with metal at the front and rear, they would be quite heavy and would sink quickly. I don't see why you would use two galleys when only one is necessary, especially when the enemy outnumbers you and you need to sink as many as possible as quickly as possible. Also, consider my points about energy conservation. It would be a better use of energy to use only one galley to sink an enemy ship. Although, to be fair, the Greek ships in these shots probably couldn't see each other, so it is unlikely they were deliberately coordinating. Now, precisely how many Persian ships actually engage with the Greek fleet in this scene is difficult to tell, but the Greeks do seem to be outnumbered. Either way, this contingent of the Persian fleet is somehow completely destroyed. Probably because the Persian galleys didn't actually do anything in the battle. I am honestly unsure how the Persians wanted to fight. I presume they wanted to ram the Greek triremes, but because their ships weren't very agile, this wasn't an option. We see their crews loosing arrows and missiles at the Greeks, but otherwise the Persians just sit there, watching the Greek fleet destroy their ships in bewilderment. I mean, do the Persians have no grappling hooks of any sort, or any ballistae on their vessels in this scene? The moment the Greek galleys started moving past them, the Persians should have tried using grappling hooks to pull them next to their vessels and engage them in melee combat. Essentially, the Persians should have tried to board. Crazy Lady sees the destruction of her forward ships, but rather than send in the rest of the fleet or lead an assault on the Greeks herself, she decides to call it a day, for no good reason at all. In the battle, 75 Persian ships were destroyed, 30 broken beyond use, and 20 damaged so badly that they need serious repairs. How do I know this?
Report?
75 ships lost, 30 damaged beyond repair, 20 could return with a few weeks' work in a safe harbour.
I always appreciate these battle reports in fiction. It appears that the Greeks didn't lose a single ship, although they did lose some men during the battle. The next day, another battle begins. The clouds are rather foreboding, and there is obscuring mist on the waters, but the weather in general is a lot calmer, so it is a better day for a marine conflict. Arch-moron Themistocles seems to have become a lot smarter, or seems to have realised his luck won't be great forever, and decides to adopt a strategy more fitting for a smaller naval force fighting a bigger one. Using the mist as a weapon, he lures the advanced Persian force into a narrow strait blocked with a ship, and orders his men on the land to board the trapped galleys. This is not a bad strategy, and the way it is depicted in the film, I can see it working, although it would be difficult to execute, because the fog would not only make it hard for the Persians to see where they were rowing, but also for the Greeks. But in theory, this plan could work rather well. However, there are some serious questions here concerning the way in which Themistocles goes about his plan. We see that Arch-moron's ships are full of men ready for battle. If he wanted to lure the Persians into the strait, and then use his ships to block the exit, and board the enemy galleys from behind whilst his land forces boarded them at the front and sides, this would be commendable and sensible. However, we see later in the film, Arch-moron, and the men who were on his ships, jumping off the cliff onto the enemy ships below, which means he would have needed to land his ships nearby, and then rushed with his soldiers to where the battle was happening. Why didn't he just leave all his soldiers in the strait? Why did he pack the tops of his galleys with soldiers when they would be of more immediate use at the strait? But your Imperial Majesty, if his upper decks were empty, the Persians would have suspected something. This is perhaps true, but it is also somewhat irrelevant. Let's imagine that Archmoron had no soldiers, or the bare minimum, on the top decks of his galleys, and let's imagine the Persian general. That's right, general. Apparently the Persians don't have admirals. Noticed this, even with the distance and the mist. Would he say to his men, "Well, chaps, this is suspicious. They don't appear to have any men ready to board us. I suppose they have a special plan to defeat us. Let's call the battle off until they start acting less suspiciously." Something tells me this wouldn't go down well with Crazy Lady. Although, having said all this, the general should have been suspicious when the Greek galleys retreated upon a signal, and should have considered sending scouts into the mist to chase the Greeks, rather than sending his whole fleet after them. In war, your enemy always has a plan to defeat you, and it is best to discover what that plan is in advance, so you can prepare accordingly. Hence the objection to the notion that Themistocles should have had his men on the land rather than on his ships isn't that strong. And truth be told, if the general didn't find this sudden retreat peculiar, then I don't think he would have found a lack of men on the Greek top decks suspicious either. Jumping onto another tangent, why didn't Themistocles move behind the trapped Persian ships with his own? He could have trapped the fleet, so there would be no chance of any ships escaping, and he could have also boarded them and joined in the actual fight more quickly. This seems like a wasted opportunity. Anyway, the Persians lose again, because Crazy Lady decides to call it a day. Why didn't she land her own forces on the shore to fight the Greeks? Why didn't she find the Greek ships, which have to be resting on the shore somewhere, and destroy them? Later in the film, she sends a messenger to the Greek camp, so she knows where their base is. Why didn't she land there? Moving on, Crazy Lady finds herself very impressed with Archmoron, and decides to send a messenger to him to ask for an audience. Somehow, no one in the Greek camp spots this boat until it reaches the shore, suggesting there were no lookouts further up the coast, which means that the Persians could have attempted a surprise assault and caught the Greeks with their trousers down. Why doesn't Themistocles have lookouts positioned further up the coast, and a few ships on standby to ensure that the camp isn't vulnerable? Anyhow, Crazy Lady Artemisia wants an audience with Archmoron Themistocles, and he agrees to visit her. And this is where things get weird. Crazy Lady enters Temptress mode, and basically points out how she has more men and ships than him, and can fight for weeks. Archmoron tells her he is a virgin, and has no wife or family, because he has spent his entire life in service of Athens and Greece. The far darker and maybe more realistic explanation for this is that Themistocles is a
boy lover.
Crazy Lady tells Archmoron that he should join her and the Persians. They then have sex? I hesitate to call what they do sex, because it is not romantic or loving in the slightest. These two are literal enemies. Obviously, I shouldn't have to point out how ridiculous it is to have sex with your enemy, with the intention to get romantically involved. I also shouldn't have to point out how these guards are useless. They can hear noises inside the cabin, but rather than do their job and investigate to see whether Archmoron is taking the opportunity to kill their commander, they decide they don't want to know what is going on. Actually, serious question, do they already know what is going on? And how do they know exactly? Does Artemisia frequently fornicate with enemy commanders? Subsequently, Archmoron loses his virginity to Crazy Lady. His taste in women is terrible, but he refuses to join her, and Crazy Lady, now a spurned woman, decides she is not going to play nice with the Greek fleet any longer. The third battle begins at night, in cloudy and rather suspect weather. Why didn't Crazy Lady begin the battle in the daytime during calm weather? Time doesn't appear to be an issue, because she has already spent 2 days toying with the Greek fleet, which implies there is no rush to defeat the Greeks. I mean, seriously, what is it with this film and naval battles happening in adverse weather and light conditions? There isn't much to criticise in this battle, because the tactics used are quite simple. Let's just quickly go through what happens. Basically, the Persians have an ironclad. A proper ironclad. It appears to be coated entirely with metal. The ironclad doesn't have oars or sails, so I don't know how it moves. Is it being pulled by the current? Does it have mechanical underwater propellers which are powered by slaves? The film never shows us. Anyway, this vessel smashes through a Greek galley which didn't move out of the way quickly enough. Then the Persian ironclad spills such vast quantities of oil into the sea that if shell oil existed during the ancient era, they would feel emasculated. Meanwhile, Persian suicide swimmers of peace, with packs full of oil on their backs, swim towards some of the other Greek galleys. The Persians set the oil in the water alight and burn practically all the Greek triremes. I don't understand why the swimmers were used to destroy the fleet as well. The ironclad was releasing enough oil to get the task done, even if it did explode. As the Greeks recover from the defeat, a familiar face comes to inform them that the 300 Spartans are dead, and the Persians have won at Thermopylae. Archmoron orders the remainder of his fleet to travel to Salamis. Archmoron makes it no secret to the emissary from Persia, who also has a familiar face, that his fleet is in Salamis. Archmoron goes to Sparta to ask This is Sparta's wife for her navy to join with what remains of the allied fleet. But Queen Gorgon of 300 Rise of an Empire is different to the Queen Gorgon of 300 and says no. She says Sparta will give no more. The pragmatic and sensible Queen of 300 has been replaced by one who is not so sensible. When Crazy Lady hears that Archmoron is alive and he still has a fleet, she decides to set out at once to Salamis. King Xerxes, the "I'm too hipster to wear a crown like mainstream kings," actually shows some military competence, and says that scouts should be sent to confirm whether it's a trap or not. But Crazy Lady dismisses his advice in a rather arrogant manner. Xerxes strikes Crazy Lady, but stops short of preventing her from sailing with the entire Persian fleet to Salamis. Meanwhile, at Salamis, Archmoron gives one of the least inspiring speeches I have ever heard in an action film.
You are all right. Yes, we are down to a handful of boats. And yes, we are just farmhands. We are tradesmen. We are boys, turned to men through the sacrifice and forge of combat. I played a dangerous game, and I lost. If you choose to turn your back on me, on your country, I will not judge you. You are free to leave. You are still free men.
But somehow, it works. As a side note, this might be great meme material. For this battle, the weather is alright, and it's in the daytime as well. Archmoron decides to go on the offensive, the goal being to kill Crazy Lady, rather than to destroy the Persian fleet. Now, let us compare the fleets. So the Persians have a lot of ships, and the Greeks have 6. It is certainly the definition of a suicide mission. I would talk about this last battle, but there isn't anything to talk about. The Greeks and Persians board each other and start fighting. A lot of individual heroics take place, and I do not discuss them in these videos, so I am not going to start now.
Now! And let them send us all straight to hell!
Nope, not going to start now. Fair to say, Archmoron somehow gets to Crazy Lady, and they fight. And as their personal battle reaches an impasse, the Spartans, along with hundreds of other Greek ships, arrive in great numbers and encircle the Persian fleet. Apparently, This is Sparta's wife changed her mind and decided to come and destroy the Persian fleet at the last minute. So the Queen Gorgon of 300 Rise of an Empire reverts to being much more like the Queen Gorgon of 300 for a dramatic reveal. Crazy Lady is then killed, the Persian fleet is destroyed, and the film ends. So that is the film, and that is what I think of the military elements. But how does the film compare to 300? I stated in my military analysis video on 300 that I liked the film, but what do I think of 300, Rise of an Empire? To be honest, I think very little of this film. I think it falls into the category of unnecessary sequel. I could make another video complaining about the film, but I don't think I will. The chief issue though is not that 300 Rise of an Empire is an unnecessary sequel. Unnecessary sequels can be entertaining at least. What really kills it for me is how inferior it is to 300. The action in 300, while gory and highly stylized, doesn't feel gratuitous, and feels like it was directed by a filmmaker with a creative vision. In 300, slow motion shots were used for key moments and scenes, but 300 Rise of an Empire makes use of slow motion shots from the start for an extended period of time, and then indulges itself with gore, blood, and slow motion, to the point where you realise this film was not directed by Zack Snyder, but instead by someone who wanted to emulate him, and by someone who didn't know how to moderate his impulses. Watching some of the action scenes play out, I cannot help but consider the director, Nom Morrow, as a fan artist, creating official fan art for 300. The film has a fan art vibe. I can recommend watching 300, but I cannot recommend watching 300 Rise of an Empire, which is a shame, because it is the most recent film I am aware of that has attempted to depict ancient naval warfare. Thank you all for watching. I hope you all have an excellent day.
I played a dangerous game, and I lost!